Thanks again for being with us. Welcome to the Lubar Center at Eckstein Hall, Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we say are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Dan Egan. He is the Great Lakes reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. He is a senior water policy fellow at the UWM School of Freshwater Sciences. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist on 2 different occasions, and he is the author of this book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. This book won the J. Anthony Lucas Prize, which is given by the Neiman Foundation and the Columbia University School of Journalism. It is given to a book that exemplifies, and I'm quoting, literary grace, a commitment to serious research, and social concern. Won't you please welcome Dan Egan to Marquette University Law School.
Wow, thank you.
Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So we live on the shores of Lake Michigan, and that I'm sure makes us experts on the Great Lakes, but I did want to spend a couple of moments talking about some facts related to the Great Lakes, Dan, and let's begin there, because I think people would want to get a sense of, for example, how much of the world's fresh water supply is in the Great Lakes. Let's begin there.
Yeah, 20% of the world's surface freshwater, that's excluding glaciers, is right out there. You know, it's 94,000 square miles of water surface area, which is roughly the equivalent of the UK. It's a lot of water.
Really, like inland seas, they're described. That's really the way they appear to people.
You know, that's one of their problems, I think, is that they're called lakes, and lakes don't look like that. I don't know what the word would be, but they are seas. They're inland seas, but they're not normal lakes.
And in places like Lake Superior, the depth of Lake Superior, how deep is that body of water?
It's I think 1,100 some feet at its deepest. But the funniest thing about the depth of Lake Superior is Keith Richards once famously, in describing the vastness of the empire that is the Rolling Stones, was describing how big it is. He said it's like you go to the shore of Lake Superior and you look across and you think, oh my gosh, look at all that water. And then he paused and said, and that's just the top. Something profound about that.
So the Stones were playing a gig in Duluth, I guess, or
I have
something
no idea.
like that.
It was in Forbes magazine. I have no idea if he's ever even seen Lake Superior, but he said it.
So in terms of drinking water, how many people use Lake Michigan for drinking water?
Lake Michigan specifically, I don't have a good number for that, but it would be Chicago, and it would be Milwaukee, and it would be somewhere around 10 million people.
And for the Great Lakes, maybe 35 million or so?
Roughly, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of a fuzzy concept because not every community that's considered a Great Lakes water consumer is pulling water directly out of the lakes, but they're in the basin, so they're pulling water out of tributaries that feed the lakes. So yeah, it is, I think, accurate to say that there are some 30 to 40 million people who rely on those lakes for sustenance.
And the importance of them economically to places like Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio or Ontario, for that matter, just how important are they?
I don't think Milwaukee would be here if Lake Michigan wasn't, or if it were, it would be called Des Moines 2 or something. Not to make a knock on Des Moines, but
we love Des Moines.
Yeah, I do. It's a great city. But that's a great lake, and that's why Milwaukee evolved as it did, and it was everything. I mean, it was a source of food. It was how people got here, and today, I mean, look at what Foxconn would not be eyeing this place if there was not a bunch of water.
So we have good reasons to be concerned about our Great Lakes, and yet I think if you read Dan's book, you'll walk away from it being deeply concerned, maybe even disgusted at times at what's happened to our Great Lakes. And you say that the biggest problem, and I think you said this in the first few pages of the book, you said the greatest threat to the Great Lakes is ignorance.
Our ignorance, yes.
What do you mean by that?
I just think that there's a lack of, for lack of a better word, Great Lakes literacy out there. I don't think that people really understand, A, how unique they are, how valuable they are, both ecologically and economically, and then how vulnerable they are, and that they, can't suffer the abuses that we have, put upon them over the last 2 centuries and still function in some kind of a natural way. one of their vulnerabilities is their size. They look too big to get really hurt, and they have been, and they will continue to be damaged if we don't do more to protect them.
I want to talk about what's happened to the Great Lakes. They have changed considerably over the years. One of the biggest changes was caused by the St. Lawrence Seaway, which in, I think, the 1950s was considered this incredible engineering feat. This would create a fourth coast, in essence. This would connect us with countries in Europe, for that matter, who would be able to send their overseas freighters through the Seaway and into the Great Lakes. What did the St. Lawrence Seaway ultimately mean for the Great Lakes?
Well, it was a good idea, or it seemed like a good idea at the time. You look at a globe or a map, and it looks like we have this North American Mediterranean. You see these big blue blobs in the middle of the continent, and then you can see a tendril going out to the sea, which is the St. Lawrence River. That's on a map. On the ground or on the water, it's a different story. These lakes were essentially isolated from the rest of the aquatic world literally as much as a pond up in the North Woods. There was no way for other species to get up into the lakes because the St. Lawrence River is in its natural state, just a roaring torrent. And then there is the not small matter of Niagara Falls, which separates Erie, Michigan, Huron, and Superior from the Atlantic Ocean. And on the backside, we have this subcontinental divide, which has made so much news recently with water diversions and whatnot. So what the St. Lawrence Seaway did was it cracked open that geographic and biological isolation that the lakes had evolved enjoyed, for lack of a better word, for some 10,000 years. And the hope was that we would get, ships, overseas ships from around the world and turn Milwaukee and Duluth and Green Bay and Chicago into bustling international ports rivaling anything on the coasts. The reality was a little bit different. And it was because the Seaway, building what is essentially a nautical elevator out to the sea, was very expensive, and at the time it was resisted by the coastal cities for obvious reasons. They didn't want the competition, and by the railroads. So they built it small. They built it to match some existing locks that bypass Niagara Falls, that connect Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, and those locks were built in the 1930s. So in the late 1950s, when the Seaway opened, it was all of its locks and channels were built to match those 1930 era locks. So in a way, it was arguably obsolete before it opened because it couldn't accommodate the ever-growing size of the world's freighter fleets. So what we've ended up with is kind of a boutique business, very few ships, almost from day one, but today.
So what, about 2 a day overseas freighters?
On average, 2 a day come up the St. Lawrence Seaway into all the Great Lakes, and that's during the 9-month shipping season. And that accounts for, I believe, I don't have the number in front of me, but in a typical year, it's less than 5% of the cargo that's moved on the lakes. I'm not saying that shipping on the Great Lakes is not an important critical business industry, but the overseas component of it, the component of it that I'm assuming we'll talk about that has done so much damage, is really small. It's not even a sliver of the pie, or it's a very small.
Well, let's talk about the damage, because by allowing the Seaway to exist in some respects, we've allowed non-native species to exist in the Great Lakes. They have found their way into the Great Lakes. You tell the story of the changes to the Great Lakes through the stories of 3 different fish: the lake trout, the sea lamprey, and the alewife.
Yes.
Why did you pick those 3, and what's really the story that you're telling with those examples?
Well, and to be clear, there were some shipping channels before the Seaway. I mean, we had the Erie Canal, and then the Canadians were working on a micro Seaway all along, and that was the Welland Canal, the system of locks that bypasses Niagara Falls. So with these early channels, we got 2 devastating invasions, starting a few decades before the Seaway opened. So real simply, make it overly simple, the lakes used to be basically run by lake trout. They were the wolves in the system. They controlled the energy flow. They ate all the little fish and kept things in check. With the opening of these canals, up came a couple of species that totally rewired the way the lakes naturally, historically worked. And the first one to come through was the sea lamprey, which looks like an eel. It's technically a fish, and it's a coastal species. but it's anadromous. That means that it is born in freshwater, it spends its adult life in saltwater, and it returns to freshwater to spawn. But it doesn't need to have that saltwater component to its life if it can find a suitable surrogate for the sea, for the ocean. And that's what it found here in the Great Lakes. It slithered its way up on its own. You cannot blame the overseas shipping industry for this. It did not come in there.
Just through the canals. Yeah.
It swam its way, it arguably, did it the natural way. It just swam up. And it found heaven in the Great Lakes. I mean, it went to town on the lake trout, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. I believe they're in the book, but as recently as the mid-1940s, we were still harvesting some 6 million pounds of lake trout out of Lake Michigan annually, and within a decade, that number was at 0. And how it happened was these lampreys are parasites. And they make their living they're like vampires. They suck the blood out of their host. And so they would slither up next to a lake trout and suck the life out of it. And the lakes, being ecologically naive, as I was speaking earlier about their isolation, their cast of characters didn't have any kind of natural resistance to this kind of an invader. So boom, there go the lake trout, and with nothing to check the flow of energy below it, the forage fish, the little fish, started to explode. And unfortunately for the Great Lakes, behind the lampreys came the alewives. And I'm sure many people in this room remember the dark days of the
late 60s.
Late 60s when alewives were dying by the billions and turning the lakefront into just a stinking, rotting, nasty place to be. So that is a real crystal clear example of what this, as I refer to it, and I didn't create this concept, it's well known in ecological circles, but biological pollution. It totally changed the way the lakes work, and they were broken by the 1960s. There was nothing to check the alewives, so all we had were, and I should mention that the alewives are anadromous, just like the lampreys. They don't need to spend their adult life in saltwater, but because of that, they're under stress in the lakes all the time, and that made them vulnerable to die-offs, and that's what we were getting in the 60s.
So the ecosystem is changed dramatically. And then the question is, so what do we do about that? And this was fascinating to me in the book, is that you had natural resource managers, biologists, who looked at, for example, Lake Michigan, and they said, so let's recreate the ecosystem, but we're going to make it different, and we're going to make it more interesting and exciting for fishermen. What did they do?
Well, it was a sequence of events, but what happened was, with these lampreys running wild, there was nothing we could do about that until the lampreys were brought under control. So in the 1950s, when we had this horrible ecological situation, the states and the provinces of the Great Lakes got together and decided to solve it. Unlike what's going on today, I might mention with the potential threat of Asian carp down in Chicago. That's tearing apart, this sense of regionalism that we have. But the lampreys didn't tear us apart back in the 1950s and 1960s. The lampreys brought us together, and they did so by pressing the U.S. and Canadian governments to develop a specific poison to control the lampreys. It's called lampricide, which I think makes everybody feel good. So these lampreys are. I think they found a fossil that's, I think it's 370 million years old. They really haven't had an evolutionary tune-up or upgrade in hundreds of millions of years. They're just so good at what they do. But because of that, they're left with a rather crude liver, which made them vulnerable to this specific type of poison that was developed up in northern Michigan. And it turned out we didn't have to dump barrels or plane loads of poison in the lakes to control them. Through great science and research, we figured out where they spawned, and it was a relatively few number of tributaries feeding the Great Lakes, and then they applied this dose of poison, this lampricide, which was like an ecosystem scale chemotherapy. And it brought the lampreys under control down to about 10% of their peak population. It's a program that is going on today. I mean, the lakes are chronically sick, and they need this lampricide, or they're going to go back to the dark days of the 1960s. Anyway, we get the lampreys under control. Now it's time to do something about the alewives, and arguably the natural answer would be to bring back the lake trout, remnant species, populations of which hung on in the far north and in Lake Superior. And we had hatcheries at the time, and we could have launched a full-scale hatchery restocking program. But the state of Michigan had a better idea. They literally thought it would be more fun to bring in salmon. They thought that that would be a better fish for the recreational anglers, and they would probably do a better job of controlling the alewives because, as I said earlier, they're an ocean species, they're a schooling species, and Chinook, Pacific Chinook salmon are built to eat such a fish. So if you think about this, we've got an East Coast invader in the alewife ravaging the Great Lakes, and we bring in a West Coast predator, and here we are in the middle of the continent, and it was a biological experiment. It really was an experiment. Nobody knew what was going to happen when they put those first salmon in. They thought they might have some kind of sense for the ocean and just head down the seaway and be gone, but they didn't. They went to town on the alewives, and from the late 1960s all the way up till today, we've had this great recreational fishery. It's come at a cost. We've lost, to a large degree, a lot of our native species because we are managing for these salmon. That said, people want it, and the salmon did a lot of good for the lakes in that once people started caring about the fish in them, they started caring more about the lakes, so it created a greater constituency for them. But we're at a chapter now where this arguably marvelously successful salmon stocking program is in grave danger, and it's already disappeared. The salmon have already disappeared on Lake Huron, and there are signs that we could be headed that way on Lake Michigan, because what's happened is this, as we were just speaking, this is considered the first chapter of this story that is the lakes. We lost the top of the food chain. Today, we're losing the bottom of the food chain, and it's not because of lampreys or alewives, it's because of invaders that have come up in the bellies of these ocean-going freighters, in the ballast tanks, which are used to stabilize less than full freighters on open water. Those ballast tanks don't contain sterile water. They contain, as I say in the book, perhaps the most powerful pollutant there is, DNA. They contain species from all over the world, and that's how we got zebra and quagga mussels, and that's why Lake Michigan and Lake Huron now are rivaling, and I believe Lake Huron, I just read, is now clearer than Lake Superior, which has long been a very relatively sterile body of water because it is so cold up there. The mussels have basically sucked the plankton out of the lakes, and the plankton sustains everything above it all the way up to the salmon. So with the plankton populations just down to about 10% of what they were before we got our zebra and quagga mussels in the 1980s, 1990s. They really exploded in the early 2000s. We're getting what the one commercial fisherman once told me is a liquid desert out there. Really? He was the last commercial fisherman in Milwaukee, and when he left in 2011 for Alaska, he was able to catch more fish in one day up in Alaska than he was able to catch all year on Lake Michigan, and he couldn't even pay for his gas going.
These mussels are everywhere. I mean, they coat pipes in the water. They coat the shoreline. I mean, it's truly amazing what they do and how quickly they can populate a region.
Yeah, you know, they're like fingernail sized, and so you think, how can a little critter like this be so devastating? But the important thing is to not look at them as individuals. You look at them like a disease, and those are individual cells. There's actually an interesting article in the New Yorker this week where a guy compares zebra and quagga mussels to cancer cells. But that's a different story.
They travel well, too, because this was an interesting part of the book. You're reading about the problems these mussels present to the Great Lakes. And then you start talking about Lake Powell and Lake Mead out west and the problems they're presenting out there. How did they end up out there?
Well, I organized the book and this story in a number of ways. And one is I talk about the front door and the back door. The front door is the St. Lawrence Seaway. I was talking earlier about this isolation that the lakes had. So it was destroyed with the front door, and then it was further ruined with this isolation, ruined with the back door. And the back door is the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. And that is how these mussels, brought to us in the 1980s aboard Great Lakes freighters, made their way out of the lakes. They can't swim, but they can drift on currents, and they can get sucked up into the ballast tanks of lakers, which are moving a lot of cargo and a lot of water around the lakes. And they went tumbling down the currents of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal into the Mississippi River Basin, which spans 40% of the continental U.S., some 1.2 million square miles, and then it was just off to the races once they got into the Mississippi, because then they can ride on, attach themselves to the hulls of barges and different boats. And eventually, it was just a matter of time. Everybody knew it was coming. They were going to make it over the Rocky Mountains, and again, they didn't swim over the Rocky Mountains. They caught a ride on a recreational boat. The first one was discovered in Lake Mead in 2007. And now, if you were to go out west, and I'm sure some of you have and have seen these signs and have gotten a sense of the effort that they're going to stop these individual invasions of these, you know, first of all, you have reservoirs, then you have, I mean, the whole West is premised on humans delivering water, you know, in a very specific way, and the mussels gum up that system. And they have not yet gotten into the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia and Snake River drainages with those big hydroelectric power plants. But if they do, they say it's going to be $1 billion problem per year.
Yeah.
Can I just move?
Yes.
What's interesting is they came through, so I've been out west a couple of times reporting for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and then material that later made its way into this book, about what the West is doing to try to combat this. And on Lake Powell, when I was out there a few years ago, they had these checkpoints, and to inspect your boat, and if you don't go through one of these checkpoints, you get a fine. And even if you're a local guy at Lake Powell, everybody knows you, and this literally happened. This guy had a jet ski. He only jet skis on Lake Powell, but he didn't go through the checkpoint, and he got a $5,000 fine. The lake was since then, it's been invaded by zebra mussels. But those mussels got here via the seaway, and now there are thousands of lakes and rivers and untold numbers of boat ramps that are being checked. There's checkpoints on the highways, and this all started with the gates of opening to one exquisitely narrow pinch point called the St. Lambert Lock. It's on the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's the first lock at Montreal. It's 80 feet wide. When you open that 80-foot wide, I mean, think about it. It's not a very wide gap. You open those doors there, you open up a boatload of trouble to a whole continent. Last thing I'll say about this poor jet skier getting a $5,000 fine. I want to say that the shipping industry they've taken a lot of steps, and they are to be commended. In the last 10 years, they've started flushing their ballast tanks with mid-ocean salt water, the idea being that they would kill or expel any kind of freshwater hitchhiker, and we've dramatically reduced the number of non-native species arriving in the lakes since then, although just in the last 6 months, 2 more have been announced or discovered. Anyway, when a ship comes through that first lock, or a lock just upstream, they have their ballast tanks inspected for salt water, and it's supposed to be, I think it's 30 parts per thousand. Whatever the number is, it's got to have seawater in it, and if it doesn't, they've got to agree to seal those ballast tanks, and if they don't, if for some reason they discharge that water on their trip into the Great Lakes, they get fined. How much? I think they've turned the screws on the industry a little bit since I've published the book, but it was commonly a $3,000 fine. These boats can carry like 6 million gallons of ballast water, and they're getting smaller fines than the jet skier.
The water, yeah, the jet skier.
They are disinfecting swim noodles at boat ramps out west.
It's amazing. It's amazing. So the mussels pose an enormous threat to the Great Lakes and to other waterways, as you just described, Dan. I want to talk about another threat, and this is one to our south of Milwaukee. And this is carp, and we're talking silver carp or bighead carp. Sometimes we hear about the Asian carp, flying carp. Yeah. They literally, if you drive a boat down the river south of Chicago, and you'll see these things come out of the water, and they hit people in the head and injure them. I mean, seriously, there's amazing video on, if you Google it, you'll find it, say, flying carp. You'll see it everywhere. Yeah. It's an amazing threat, but the question is how close now, based on the reporting you've done, how close are these carp to entering the Great Lakes? Lake Michigan,
they may be in Lake Michigan already. I mean, they found one back in June above this electric barrier on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which is the last line of defense.
The barrier is supposed to stop them from
barrier is supposed to stop them. Somehow I think it's a 9-pound carp made its way through, and anybody who's ever found a cockroach in their kitchen and they kill it, they're fools if they think they solved their cockroach problem. You know, there's usually more than one. There almost always is. So there's a pretty good chance that there are a number of these Asian carp swimming in Lake Michigan. The question is, are they going to ravage the water out there the way they have the Mississippi River Basin and the Illinois River? And
Voracious eaters, right?
yeah, the thing is, as I was mentioning earlier, the mussels have really literally decimated the plankton populations. They are about 10% of what they were pre-mussels. So they may not find enough to eat out there to thrive. That's out in the big water. But in the harbors and the rivers, the tributaries that feed the lakes, that places that people happen to boat, the best science says that they should be able to thrive. And if they do, and it may take, invasions are tricky things. It can take years, decades, even more before a population goes from dormant to explosive. And I don't know if we'll see it in our lifetime, but I certainly don't want to take a chance that we will. And so I do think we need to do more than just have this arguably flimsy electric barrier on the Chicago Canal, which connects the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River Basin.
Yep.
The story of the carp, though, where they came from, is really interesting. Again, it seemed like a good idea at the time. They brought them over, they being the U.S. government, brought them over initially to clean fish farm ponds. And there are 4 species.
Down south, right?
Down south. Mm-hmm. Grass carp, black carp, bighead, and silver. And so the grass carp were brought in, and it was 1964, and the idea was, let's not dump so many chemicals in the water, let's try to find some kind of natural solution. And it was, for the time, a good idea. It was going very well, and a private fish farmer, who was a very powerful guy, he ended up running for governor in Arkansas unsuccessfully, but he was a powerful man down in Arkansas. He wanted his own crop of grass carp, so he imported some, and he got all 4 species. And he only wanted the grass carp, so he turned them over. He did the responsible thing. He turned them over to the Arkansas Game and Fish Department, and they could have dumped some bleach in those tanks and solved the problem right there. They didn't. They were fascinated by these fish, and they started trying to get them to reproduce, and they had a heck of a time doing it. They had to bring in an aquaculturist from the United Nations, and they finally got these fish to breed, and so they started using them in sewage treatment experiments because they were such voracious filter feeders. The idea was they could put them in sewage lagoons, and this was phase 1. Put the fish in the sewage lagoon, have them eat the floating stuff, the water comes out cleaner. Phase 2, sell those fish as fillets. The FDA learned about this and said there's no way those are going to end up in grocery stores if they're feasting on human stuff. And this was during the Carter administration, and the funding dried up for this program real quickly when Carter left office. And so these game and fish employees, I talked to them personally. I've talked to a guy who says he ended up becoming a member of the Game and Fish Commission for the state. He let open the floodgates along with a bunch of other people and just let them loose. They didn't think they would reproduce because they had such a hard time getting them to breed in captivity. And then it was off to the races, and they've been migrating north ever since.
A bad science experiment.
Bad science experiment.
I mean, it really is.
Again, though, these things, I want to be able to look at it through the context
At the time.
of the time. Yeah, because, but to be fair to them, we've got to be fair with ourselves, too. What are we doing today that are going to make people in a room like this in 50 years go, what are they thinking?
Talk a bit about another thing that it's a phenomenon that you now see, especially on Lake Erie, but you can also find it in the Bay of Green Bay to some extent, and these are these algal blooms that happen in the summer. You did reporting over in Ohio, near Toledo, Ohio. Toledo, as we know, had serious water problems a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, where you couldn't drink the water because it was so toxic. How big a problem are these algal blooms to the Great Lakes today?
Well, they're huge. I mean, it is ridiculous that we live on the world's greatest body of lakes, and they at times become too poisoned to drink. And this problem in Toledo isn't going to go away anytime soon, and it's tied to, all this stuff's related. It's tied to over-application of fertilizer that is creating these algae blooms, or algal blooms. Every time I say that, somebody sends me an email.
You're okay with me.
Okay. And then historically, these blooms would have been a whole assemblage of species, but because of these dreaded mussels, You can go on YouTube again and get these videos of these mussels sucking all the plankton out of the water. They're brainless. They're dumb, but they're smart enough not to eat this certain type of toxic algae called microcystis. They'll spit it back out. So they're selecting for just this species. So when you get an algal bloom today, it's going to be dominated by this toxic algae, and it isn't just unsightly; it's poisonous, and that's what got into the Toledo drinking water system back in, I think it was 2014. And you can't boil order your way out of this like we did with crypto, because it only concentrates the toxins. So you had a city of 500,000 people, and they had no alternative source of drinking water. The National Guard was bringing in bottled water by the pallets and baby formula in places as far away as Ann Arbor. By the do not drink order went out around 1 o'clock in the morning for a Saturday morning, and by dawn, the shelves in Ann Arbor were empty of drinking water.
Some have called this the canary in the coal mine. Do we expect this to happen again, Dan?
Yeah, well, Lake Erie is it's its own place, particularly the Western Basin, and they're going to have this problem until they get a handle on their phosphorus applications. It's a seasonal thing. It's as predictable as leaves falling from trees. And we've got a similar situation up in Green Bay. Fortunately, in Green Bay, they don't draw their water from the bay. They run a pipe over to Manitowoc, and so they get open Lake Michigan water. But it is a canary in the coal mine. We had algae problems back in the 1960s, and we figured out how to solve them. That's when they were proclaiming Lake Erie dead, because these algal blooms explode, and then they eventually die, and that burns up so much oxygen that they create these dead zones in which almost nothing can exist. And this was a huge problem back in the 1960s. And again, it brought the region together. It didn't tear them apart like it kind of is with this phosphorus problem on Lake Erie. It brought us together, and we put Lake Erie and really all the lakes on a phosphorus diet. And the turnaround between 1972 and 1985 was just dramatic. And it was just a testament to the virtues of modern pollution control. And we now have a new problem, and it's similar. It's not the same, but we also have another prescription. I mean, the best scientists have gotten together and said we need to further eliminate the phosphorus load going into Lake Erie. Specifically, it's a dissolved reactive phosphorus. It's very potent, and if they can get a handle on that, they can get a handle on the blooms and the lake. The beautiful thing about Lake Erie is it's the smallest lake, and so they call it its residence time. Every 2.7 years, you basically get a new lake because so much water is pulsing through there. So you fix the pollution load, and that pollution flushes out, and you can start to see some dramatic results really soon.
I want to talk about the future in just a moment, but a couple things I did want to touch on before we get to that. We've seen a lot of changes in lake levels. They seem to be fluctuating so much more than they have historically speaking. One of the things you talk about in this book is perhaps the impact of dredging on the St. Clair River, repeated dredging, and the fact that there may be even more erosion now because of that dredging. How big an issue is that for the Great Lakes?
It depends on whether the water's high or low. The dredging that they did on Lake St. Clair, or on the St. Clair River, did have a huge impact on lake levels, on the long-term average of Lakes Michigan and Huron, which are actually one body of water. That dredging has caused, again, I can't remember the specific number, but it's approaching 2 feet. It permanently lowered the lakes by 2 feet, which is bad news in low water and actually is good news in high water. The bigger issue, and the St. Clair issue is tied to it, but the bigger issue is the lakes aren't getting the ice cover that they have historically, and without that ice cover, they start to absorb heat even as early as March, which means when they hit their peak temperatures, which is right about now in September, they're warmer than they've been historically. And when the cold winds in November come blowing in, that sucks the water right out of the lakes through evaporation. And so we're getting a lot more evaporation than we have in the past. This long-term average that I talked to is kind of a mythical concept because we're never really at average lake level. We're either below or above, but we've always swung 3 feet above or 3 feet below. The water's been bracketed to like a 6-foot swing. With this change in the precipitation evaporation dynamic, they're talking about swings of 4 to 5 feet above and below, which is a 10-foot high, which is hugely problematic, not just for navigation and property owners, but also in 1986 when we had high water. We came within, somebody once told me, I never verified it, but we were within about 14 inches of Lake Michigan pushing back against Jones Island. That whole sewage treatment is premised on gravity, and if the lake gets higher, we are in a fix. So we need that lake level to be where it's been historically, and we may not be able to do much about it, which brings us back to the St. Clair River. A lot of people believe we should put some kind of control on the river to restore the lakes to their natural 2 feet average higher level. It's a good idea, but there's problems with it. One is who gets to set the dial, because what's good for somebody is bad for somebody else. And two, you better be right when you make the call, because you've got to have some pretty sophisticated predictive models to be able to, there's so much inertia built into the system. You may turn it down, and in 4 months, you should have been turning it up. So I don't know if we are, if we have the engineering ability to do that at this point, but we may be pushed to do it at some point, because a 10-foot swing on Lake Michigan would be disastrous.
Be huge.
Yeah.
I want to talk about where we are today and where we might be in the future of the Great Lakes. A lot of this book, as I said, I think you could describe it as alarming, and yet the lakes are pretty amazing. You talk in this book, Dan, about Lake Huron, for instance. You're seeing signs of recovery in Lake Huron.
Yes.
What is happening in Lake Huron?
Well, and people ask me if I get depressed writing about this stuff, and I don't. I mean, because it's fascinating, and I also am pretty optimistic in general, and specifically about the lakes, that, if we can just give them a break from this onslaught of invasions, they can reach a new balance. And that's what happened on Lake Huron. I talked earlier about these alewives and what an ecological disaster it was. They were considered basically a cockroach of a fish, and we ended up controlling them with a predator. There's another cockroach of a fish out there today, and it came up the St. Lawrence Seaway the same way that mussels did in the ballast of overseas freighters. It's called the round goby, and people considered them a scourge at first, but they came from the same place as the mussels, from the Caspian Sea basin, and they are nature built to feast on these mussels. And it turns out anything that can eat a goby is going to do all right. Gobies are basically unlocking that energy source tied up in these mussel shells. Unfortunately for salmon, they can't do that, but native fish, lake trout, walleye, whitefish, which aren't even piscivores, they're not fish-eating fish, are evolving to eat gobies. If it's death or a goby, they'll take a goby. And they're starting, the native species on Lake Huron are starting to thrive. The top of the food chain over on Lake Huron looks more like its natural self today than it has any time in probably the last 70 to 100 years. The bottom of the food chain may look a little bit more like the Caspian Sea, but the top of the food chain is reaching this new kind of balance, and they're talking about they've been maintaining a lake trout population only through limited hatchery plantings. So there's a lot of tension between the lake trout advocates, which is typically the federal government, and the salmon advocates, which is the state governments, which are the state governments, because they do compete for the same food, or they did. With alewife disappearing over there because of the mussel infestation, you're seeing a surge in native species. So this is starting to show signs of happening on Lake Michigan as well. And it's not going to have, if it does happen, it won't be without pain, because the recreational fishing industry really relies on salmon, and they deserve a lot of credit for bringing people back to the lake and back to caring about the lakes. But what's good for the salmon is bad for the lake trout, and vice versa. And it is, in a way, encouraging that nature seems to be asserting itself once again, and we're reaching a new kind of natural balance, one that doesn't take millions of hatchery plantings every year, and what is essentially a put-and-take fishery right now.
Just a quick follow-up on the whitefish. People go to Door County, they eat whitefish. We just kind of expect it. And it had been decimated, but as you point out in the book, it's something of a comeback. And I think you interviewed a fisherman from maybe it's Washington Island or somewhere, and he was saying that, you could almost literally see the whitefish evolving in front of them. In the way they were adapting to the new reality they faced.
Yeah. That's what the commercial fishermen will say that. They'll say it's evolution. What the biologists will say is it's plasticity, but I don't care. The fish are changing, and they're seeing fish coming in with their jaws ripped because they're having to get their mouths around whole fish. And whitefish are typically grubbing out a living off the bottom of the lake, and they historically ate this diperia, which is like a shrimp, which disappeared with the mussels. So yeah, it is. They're saying, we're watching Mother Nature at work, and it's encouraging.
Are there, and this gets into kind of a really interesting discussion area, are there genetic tools that scientists want to apply to the Great Lakes in an effort to address some of the challenges you write about?
Emerging, yeah. In Australia, the common carp are a big problematic species, and they've been doing a lot of genetic tinkering, working on this concept called daughterless carp, where the fish will only have male offspring, and their offspring will only have male offspring. And the idea is that you would plant a batch of these daughterless carp into a system, and they would literally breed themselves to extinction. It's scary. I mean, again, here we are. Maybe it sounds like a good idea, but it's got to be well thought out. But there are tools. I mean, I went down there. I went down to Tasmania and talked to these biologists, and they were saying that, it's not going to be too long until this is going to be a reality, and it's not going to be carp specific. I asked him, mussels included, and he said, mussels included. The question is, if we do this, if we achieve this technology, who decides? Back in the 1960s, it was the state of Michigan. They unilaterally decided to put salmon in the lakes, no matter what anybody else thought, they were going to do it. And obviously, fish don't respect borders. Who's the governing body that's going to make that decision for the lakes going forward? And we don't have one, and that's one of the problems.
And this will be my final question here, and we'll take questions from the audience. The final point, I guess, in this is that there are answers, and there are a couple of them just sort of staring us in the face. You talk about closing the front door and closing the back door. We could say no to overseas freighters coming into the Great Lakes Seaway. We could say we're going to make sure that the Chicago shipping canal is no longer connected to the Mississippi River Basin. We could do that. Why don't we do that? If we're pretty sure that would at least give the Great Lakes a break and a chance to maybe regain some new vigor, why don't we do that?
That's a great question. And I don't know what the answer is. And I'm not advocating that we shut, as they're called affectionately, salties, ocean-going ships, out of the lakes. They're under court order now to install ballast water treatment systems, which is supposed to give them another level of protection beyond the saltwater flushing. And that technology is available, but they're saying that it's expensive and it may not be 100% fail-safe, so they've been dragging their heels, and they basically make the argument that it's an intractable problem. What's floated in this book through the voices and the opinions of some very smart people is, well, if it's that difficult of a problem to solve, why don't we just not let those boats in until they solve it? Do a cost-benefit analysis. What are we getting from this cargo, and what's it costing us? And I think if they can't get adequate ballast treatment systems on those boats pretty quickly, that's something that should be put on the table. I don't know why anybody would be afraid of having that discussion. And I think the answer, I guess, is that it would show that we've given, that industry has taken a lot from the lakes and has given the economy a fair amount, but not commensurate with the damage they've done. As far as the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, that would be a very expensive project, but it's about more than just carp. That's an invasive species superhighway. As I mentioned earlier, stuff is coming out of the lakes going into the middle of the continent. And it also, that canal reflects, again, it was a great idea at the time, but this Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal is really a three-sided sewer. It's the reason why Chicago, at one of its wastewater treatment plants, it will disinfect its discharges, but at the other two main ones, unless something has changed in the last couple of years, I don't think it has, they don't disinfect their sewage. They sift out the bad stuff, and then they just let nature bake it out on its way down to St. Louis, which drinks from the Mississippi River, where this stuff flows. Chicago has a responsibility, I would argue, like any other city on the Great Lakes, to adequately treat its sewage. And once they do that, you could hydrologically separate the basins, the Mississippi from the Great Lakes, as they were in their natural state for thousands of years.
Let me take a few questions from the audience. Those of you who've been here before know how this goes. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but keep your finger down on the rim. We'll be able to hear your question. If you're in the back, wait for Ryan who has a microphone. He'll hold the microphone. You can ask your question. Again, no speeches. If you can keep the questions short, we'll get to more of them. Marcia, go ahead. Just hang on for Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you. This was great to have you here. Is Foxconn coming here worrying you? Should it be worrying us?
Lots of stuff worries me. I work at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and we have a number of reporters who are aggressively and I think expertly reporting on this at the moment. I am a little concerned that we're talking about relaxing some of the environmental regulations that any other industry would be required to do to, cite itself down there, specifically giving them a waiver on an environmental impact statement. I don't know what goes into making flat screen televisions, but, I know it takes a ton of water, and if it's taking water, that water is being intensively used. And by used, I'm talking about it's being polluted. And so we've got to make sure that we do everything we can to protect that lake, because that plant may indeed make it till 2043, but the lakes are going to make it way past that, and we owe it to the people beyond 2043 to do everything we can not to make the mistakes that previous generations did by treating the lakes as a dump for a relatively short-term economic gain.
Yes, sir.
What is the relationship between Canada and the United States on the Great Lakes? Is it good? I noticed there was some bitterness years ago.
Yeah, I think that it is good. I mean, there's the International Joint Commission. There is no overarching government or by-government body that makes specific decisions for the lakes. It's done through collaboration, and it has been pretty good. And there's been a lot of nice cooperation, positive cooperation between the states as well. That's starting to fray on a number of fronts. A lot of people didn't notice it, but earlier this year, we were talking about the salmon stocking program. On Lake Michigan, that was done incredibly collaboratively with the Great Lakes states that manage Lake Michigan, which would be Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. And they would sit down every year and they would say, how many salmon are we going to plant in the lake based on how many alewives do we believe are out there? Well, this year, Wisconsin didn't like the size of the pie that they were given to plant salmon, so they said, we'll go on our own. And I thought that was a distressing move, because we've got to work together on these issues. And so Canada and the U.S., they both work together on getting the Great Lakes Compact, which is about the best protection we can reasonably have today, governing water diversions outside the basin. And hopefully that collaboration continues into the future.
Let me take other questions. Yes, sir?
Question about Waukesha taking water out of the basin. If Waukesha takes water out of the basin, they say they're going to put it back in, but because of the cost down the road, they're probably just going to get rid of it the other way. What precedent does it start that we let Waukesha take water out of Lake Michigan Basin?
As long as they send it back, and they have to, under terms of the compact, send it back, it doesn't really, in my mind, set that terrifying of a precedent at all. We're basically forcing them to engineer themselves into the lakes. But this Great Lakes Compact, which was passed, I believe it was 2008, it required congressional approval, and what Congress gives, Congress can take away. And so I think vigilance is definitely going to be required, not just in the coming years, but in the coming decades, as pressures from outside the basin increase for clean water. I used to think that it was ridiculous to think that we could appreciably lower Lake Michigan or the Great Lakes in general by piping water out west. It would just be too expensive and too big of an undertaking, until I started doing some reporting on oil coming from the far west into the Great Lakes Basin. We're moving some 2.6 million barrels per day of mostly Canadian tar sands oil, which is thick as peanut butter. They have to dilute it to get it to even flow, to dilute it down to a state of basically glue. And 2.6 million barrels is roughly the flow of the Milwaukee River at the end of a dry summer. So we're getting a river of oil coming our way. There's no reason we couldn't be sending rivers of water out west. But as far as Waukesha getting that water, so long as they send it back, I think that, it's not going to be a big precedential.
And the compact allows for that, the
com-
language of the compact,
the
because they're
language-
adjacent to the basin, right?
The compact was really, to a large degree, written to get Waukesha and places just like it water. Otherwise, it never would have been politically palatable for the Wisconsin legislature to approve it, and it required approval from all the state legislatures.
Let's take other questions. Yes?
I read that 300 years ago, the French voyageurs and fur traders called Green Bay Bay de Puant, which meant stinking bay because of all the dead fish and algae. And this was long before there was any human settlement, much less industry.
Yeah.
Isn't that an indication that some of these problems may be unsolvable without a massive infusion of some kind of technical solution?
Yeah. My dad brings this point up. He worked for the paper industry up in Green Bay, and I always heard that story when I was a kid. But one person's stink is another person's, perfume. Green Bay was the world's largest freshwater estuary, and that stink was the sign of a very healthy, productive fish nursery, basically. Green Bay stinks today. Well, it doesn't stink like it did when I was a kid, but that's industrial, fouling, and there's a big difference. I mean, anybody who's spent any time in bogs and wetlands know that there's a funk in the air, but that funk is not the sign of any kind of toxicity.
Yes. Is there somebody in the back there, too? Did you have a question back there earlier? Okay, maybe not. Okay, go ahead. I'll get you. No, hang on one second.
Across the NOAA group and any effect or impact of the sanctuaries that were set up in Michigan and attempting to set up in Wisconsin?
I have to say I'm not up to speed on that. I was driving down from Door County just on Sunday, and I saw there's a billboard right outside of Sheboygan. I don't know enough to comment about that. I'm sorry.
On the rim. Yeah, just keep your finger down on the rim. There you go.
How's that?
That's good.
In today's Milwaukee Journal, there's an article in the opinion page by John Stollenwerk entitled, "Must We Give Foxconn Everything, Even Our Water?" And what he states is that he didn't see any provision to prevent Foxconn from filling in their wetlands. And he argues that the wetlands are very important because they act like a sponge in the event that you have heavy rains, as they had in Houston.
Yeah.
So, comment, please.
Couldn't hear the question? So there was an op-ed piece in the newspaper today. It was written by John Stollenwerk, who used to run Allen Edmonds. He has concerns about the environmental exemptions being given to Foxconn, specifically concerns about the wetlands that might be replaced by Foxconn in the process. Is that an accurate assessment? Okay.
Yeah, and all I have to say to that is I think he raises some really good points. I mean, we don't want to go backwards in terms of protecting the Great Lakes. They've suffered a lot of damage historically, and we know a lot more than we did before. And we have a responsibility to be stewards of these things and to not shortchange them for short-term economic benefit. I'm not saying that you can't have a plant like that and adequately protect the Great Lakes. You can probably have both, and we better make sure that we do.
I'm going to take a couple more, one back there, and then we'll come over there. Just.
As citizens, how can we affect the situation both positively right now and in the future?
That's a good question, and it's complicated. And I've been asked it before, and I think that there's a couple simple answers, and they're deceptively simple, and they're answers that I try to implement myself, and that is, take your kids swimming at the lake, or take them fishing if you have the means to. Make sure that they have a relationship with the lake so they care about the lakes as they get older. And we kind of lost that a bit in the 1960s. I said earlier, I grew up in Green Bay. Even today, a kid on a bicycle can't go to a beach anywhere near Green Bay. There are no sanctioned public swimming areas on the lower bay. Bay Beach closed in the 1940s or so, and it's been closed ever since. And that's a travesty. And because of that, as a kid, I remember the Fox River flowing through my hometown and not being awed or inspired by it, but being disgusted by it. And that's just a travesty. And so I think, aside from getting up to speed on what the issues are facing the lakes and doing some things like, writing your representatives, it's make sure that your kids have a relationship with the lakes.
Dan practices what he preaches. He's got 4 kids, and this book, I think, has a beautiful ending. He talks about taking his kids fishing and kind of that relationship that's being built. Ryan, let's go up there. This may be the final question. I've got one more for Dan, actually.
So we hear a lot about the 5 gyres that are in the saltwater oceans, these floating masses of plastic and other debris. Did you find anything like that when you are studying the Great Lakes? Are plastics or other kinds of debris areas a problem?
Yeah, I think there has been legislation recently passed banning microbeads that are in the exfoliants or whatever because they were becoming a problem in the Great Lakes. And the ocean problem is obviously a big problem, and you hear about these mats of plastic the size of Texas floating, but that's like, it's almost it is an abstraction to me. I can't picture it, and I don't personally worry about it, but we don't drink the ocean, we drink that water, and so whatever we're doing to safeguard the ocean, we've got to do at least that and some more for the Great Lakes.
Thanks for the question. I'm going to ask Dan one more thing because his reporting on the Great Lakes continues, and in the last year, even since this book has been published, he's been doing some really interesting work on another challenge we face, and this is the fact that there's an oil pipelines running through the Mackinac Straits. And you're going to be doing more reporting on this in the future. Describe for us.
I'm doing it today.
People who read it and people who look at these pipes on the bottom of one of the most rapid currents in the Great Lakes might go, what are we doing?
Yeah. In 1953, they laid 2 pipes, basically just a little bit west of the Mackinac Bridge in the Straits of Mackinac, which is like the most current whipped area in all the Great Lakes. Those 2 steel pipes can carry 23 million gallons of Canadian crude a day, and they are now 64 years old, and there is a growing sentiment in Michigan that, they can't last forever. Anything a human builds, whether it's a bowling ball, a car, or a pipe, is going to break. And the question is, do you take those pipes out before or after they break? It's not an all or nothing problem. You may be able to tunnel them underneath the straits, or, and this is an emerging issue in Wisconsin, you route them through Wisconsin, as there's a whole sister network of pipes taking oil out of Canada, running it around the bottom, and by that I mean the southern tip of Lake Michigan through Chicago and back on into the Detroit area in Canada. A lot of this is Canadian oil on its way back into Canada. You know what I mean?
It's like algal.
Yeah, right. Somebody's going to email me. But the Great Lakes are being asked to take a pretty big risk, and a lot of people are thinking that that's no longer appropriate.
Didn't the Attorney General, Republican Attorney General in Michigan, say he's
pull them out? Yeah.
Pull them out. Yeah.
It's complicated. You got to get propane to the UP, and you got to get some other oil wells in Michigan. They've got to have a way to get oil to market, which currently flows on this pipeline. But he says its days are numbered. It's not going to stay.
I am going to wrap things up there. If you could just hang with me for a second here, I want to talk about what's coming up as part of our series. Next week, September 14th, we're talking about international law and foreign policy in the new Trump administration. We'll be having Ingrid Wirth, who is a leading scholar on foreign policy and international law. She is visiting us from Vanderbilt University. She will be part of that discussion. Ryan Scoville, who is a professor here at Marquette University Law School. His area of expertise is on international and foreign relations law. And also Robbie Gramer, who is a reporter. He covers the State Department for Foreign Policy magazine. So we'll be talking about A variety of things, what's happening to international law with the new administration, what's happening to agreements, whether they be trade agreements or international agreements of some kind, what's happening to institutions like the State Department. So that'll be our discussion on the 14th. Coming up later in the month, we also want to mention one of these is sold out. We're going to be talking about the future of conservatism in the Republican Party. Charlie Sykes will be here later in the month. That is sold out, but you can watch it. Live stream it if you'd like. And then 2 days after Charlie Sykes will be here, Hugh Hewitt, who's a nationally syndicated radio host, also has a television show and is a constitutional law scholar at Chapman University. He will be here to talk about that very subject. We have new programs being added to our schedule on a regular basis, so we invite you to check it out, law.marquette.edu. Having said that, I always want to thank everybody who comes to these events. We're delighted to have you with us. We hope you'll come back again soon. And again, very special round of applause and thanks to Dan Egan.
Thanks.